It was a humid summer night in Philadelphia, 1776, and the city's cobblestone streets were quiet except for the distant creak of wagon wheels and the occasional clatter of horses' hooves. Inside a modest room at the Pennsylvania State House, a group of men huddled over papers illuminated by flickering candlelight. They were creating a document that would change the world, a declaration that promised liberty, equality, and a pursuit of happiness. Yet outside that idealistic vision lay shadows these men preferred to keep hidden, shadows of greed, prejudice, personal scandal, and moral compromise. The founders, who would later be celebrated in marble halls and on U.S. currency, carried secrets that history textbooks rarely whisper: extramarital affairs, secret financial deals, and deeply complicated views on slavery and human rights. Benjamin Franklin, the diplomat, inventor, and printer, had a public face of wisdom and benevolence, but in private he had gambled away enormous sums and sometimes manipulated political outcomes for his personal benefit. Thomas Jefferson, the eloquent author of the Declaration of Independence, spoke of human equality while owning hundreds of enslaved people, including Sally Hemings, a woman he kept in a relationship that history still debates for its coercion and complexity. George Washington, venerated as a symbol of virtue and leadership, struggled with debts, personal anxieties, and a fierce determination to protect the wealth he had accumulated, even if it meant perpetuating slavery. These men were heroes in the public eye, but deeply human in their private lives, navigating ambitions, fears, and moral compromises that would leave a lasting imprint on the nation they helped create. To understand the story of America's founding is to peer behind the curtain of idealism and confront a more complicated reality. The journey begins not in 1776, but decades earlier, in the colonies, where European ambition, indigenous displacement, economic greed, and personal ambition intersected in a society both vibrant and morally conflicted. Long before the Declaration of Independence, the Atlantic world was a crucible of competition, conquest, and commerce. Families like the Jeffersons, the Adamses, and the Harrisons navigated a landscape where land, trade, and loyalty were constantly in flux. Young George Washington grew up surveying the forests of Virginia, absorbing lessons about land, power, and authority. He witnessed the brutal realities of frontier life, including violent conflicts with Native Americans, and he learned early that leadership often required difficult, morally ambiguous decisions. These formative experiences would shape his approach to command in the French and Indian War, where strategic victories often came at human costs that the young Washington later had to reconcile with his conscience. Meanwhile, across the colonies, the intellectual ferment of the Enlightenment provided fertile ground for revolutionary ideas. Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Paine, and John Adams devoured books from Europe, but they also manipulated these ideas to serve local ambitions. Franklin's experiments with electricity and his civic projects, such as establishing libraries and fire brigades, were impressive, yet he also participated in secretive schemes to advance colonial interests while maintaining favor with the British Crown, a delicate balancing act that exposed the tension between public virtue and private gain. As the colonies edged closer to open rebellion, personal rivalries and hidden agendas complicated matters. Alexander Hamilton, the fiery young immigrant from the Caribbean, harbored deep resentment toward established elites, even as he sought their approval. His intense drive would make him indispensable in forming the new nation, but it also led to bitter confrontations, scandalous duels, and alliances motivated as much by personal advancement as by principle. Similarly, John Hancock's flamboyance and wealth masked a shrewd understanding of power dynamics. His lavish lifestyle both charmed allies and enraged detractors, revealing that behind the revolutionary rhetoric were men deeply concerned with reputation, wealth, and influence. The Aselph itself, often remembered as a pristine manifesto of human liberty, carried compromises that reflected these private entanglements. Jefferson's original draft condemned slavery outright, but political negotiation forced the removal of passages attacking the British Crown for perpetuating the slave trade. The final document emerged as both a moral proclamation and a political artifact, a careful balance between high ideals and the pragmatic realities of colonial unity. Each signatory, from Hancock to Franklin to Jefferson, had negotiated these compromises while hiding personal debts, allegiances, and ambitions from public view. This pattern continued through the Revolutionary War. Washington's leadership was legendary, but his personal correspondence revealed sleepless nights worrying about supplies, troop loyalty, and the moral burden of lives lost. Jefferson's political career was propelled by intellectual brilliance, yet his private life, his relationship with enslaved women, his investments in land speculation, and his often ruthless political strategies painted a picture of a man both visionary and deeply flawed. Franklin's diplomatic triumphs in France relied not only on charm, but on intricate networks of bribery, favoritism, and manipulation, raising questions about how moral his methods truly were. As the nation moved from war to peace, these dark secrets only multiplied. The Constitutional Convention in 1787 brought to the forefront conflicts between ideals and self-interest. Slavery remained a central contentious issue, resolved through compromises that deferred justice for millions. Personal rivalries shaped debates over representation, taxation, and executive power. Hamilton and Madison clashed over the very structure of government, while Washington sought to mediate with a vision of national unity that required silencing or marginalizing voices he found inconvenient. Even as the new republic took shape, scandals emerged in plain sight. Hamilton's affair with Maria Reynolds became one of the first major public sex scandals in American history. Jefferson faced accusations of hypocrisy for preaching liberty while maintaining slavery. Adams navigated bitter personal feuds with political rivals that spilled into newspapers and pamphlets, eroding public trust while shaping policy. Franklin, in his later years, faced criticism for failing to champion certain causes that would have advanced justice more aggressively, revealing the tension between practicality and principle that defined much of the founding generation.
These contradictions did not disappear in the 19th century. They shaped the trajectory of the nation. The legacies of wealth, power, and secrecy established by the founders influenced policies on slavery, westward expansion, and political partisanship. The personal vices and virtues of these men, ambition, deceit, brilliance, and moral blindness, became embedded in the structures of government, legal precedent, and public expectation. Understanding these hidden truths challenges the sanitized mythology of the Founding Fathers and reveals a more complex, often uncomfortable story of human ambition and historical consequence. The fragile victory over Britain did not bring immediate clarity or moral resolution to the new nation. Instead, independence opened a door to deeper conflicts, many of which the Founding Fathers had postponed rather than solved. As the war ended in 1783, the triumphant leaders faced a daunting question that no battlefield victory could answer. What kind of country had they actually created? The answer depended not only on public ideals, but also on private ambitions, financial desperation, and political rivalries that threatened to fracture the fragile republic before it could stand. George Washington returned to Mount Vernon a hero revered across continents. Yet his private letters reveal a man deeply anxious about his financial stability. War had elevated his reputation, but strained his plantation. Washington had invested heavily in land speculation throughout the Ohio Valley, hoping westward expansion would secure his wealth. This ambition tied him directly to policies that encouraged displacement of Native American nations, whose presence stood between American expansion and the financial dreams of elite landowners. While Washington spoke publicly about fairness toward Native Americans, his private dealings often reflected a colder reality. He believed expansion was inevitable and frequently supported military campaigns that forced indigenous nations into devastating treaties. To many Americans, he symbolized unity and restraint. To many Native communities, his presidency marked the acceleration of land loss and cultural destruction. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson returned to Virginia burdened by personal and financial contradictions that would haunt him for decades. Jefferson's plantation at Monticello was both a symbol of intellectual refinement and a site of relentless labor performed by enslaved individuals whose lives were tightly controlled by Jefferson's management. Despite his philosophical writings on liberty, Jefferson relied heavily on enslaved labor to maintain his lifestyle and political career. His mounting debts grew so severe that he constantly expanded agricultural production, placing increasing pressure on those enslaved under his authority. Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings existed within this complex and morally troubling structure. Hemings, who was enslaved by Jefferson's family, lived in proximity to Jefferson and bore children widely believed by historians to be fathered by him. The relationship cannot be separated from the imbalance of power inherent in slavery, and it remains one of the most enduring controversies surrounding Jefferson's legacy. For Jefferson, public reputation required silence. For Hemings, historical memory would remain largely voiceless for generations. In the northern states, John Adams grappled with his own struggles between principle and pragmatism. Adams had opposed slavery more openly than some of his contemporaries, yet he often prioritized national stability over aggressive reform. Adams feared that pushing too forcefully against slavery might shatter the Union before it fully formed. His presidency later became defined by deep insecurity and a simmering resentment toward critics. Adams believed passionately in strong government authority, which led him to support the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. These laws allowed the government to punish critics and suppress dissent, contradicting the revolutionary ideals of free expression that Adams had once championed. His actions demonstrated how fear of instability could lead even the most principled founders toward authoritarian measures when they felt the republic was threatened. Alexander Hamilton, perhaps the most ambitious of the founders, emerged as both the architect of America's financial system and one of its earliest scandal-ridden political figures. Hamilton's vision of a powerful central government and industrial economy clashed sharply with Jefferson's agrarian ideals. Hamilton believed economic strength required close cooperation between government and wealthy financial interests, a philosophy that alarmed those who feared aristocracy. Behind Hamilton's bold policies lay personal motivations shaped by his impoverished upbringing in the Caribbean. His relentless drive for recognition and influence fueled his political brilliance, but also his recklessness. In 1791, Hamilton began an affair with Maria Reynolds, a married woman whose husband later exploited the relationship for blackmail. Hamilton, desperate to protect his political career, secretly paid money to Reynolds' husband. When political opponents uncovered the payments, Hamilton publicly confessed to the affair in a pamphlet, believing scandal was preferable to accusations of financial corruption. The confession shocked the young nation and established a precedent for public exposure of private misconduct among political leaders. Benjamin Franklin, by then elderly and celebrated as a global symbol of Enlightenment wisdom, carried his own hidden contradictions. Franklin once owned enslaved people, but later became a vocal advocate for abolition, reflecting a transformation that some critics viewed as too little too late. His earlier business ventures included printing advertisements for slave sales, a reality that complicated his later moral stance. Franklin's diplomatic success in securing French support during the Revolution involved lavish social maneuvering and careful cultivation of his image as a charming and eccentric philosopher. Behind this persona lay calculated political strategy. Franklin understood that diplomacy often required manipulation, and he excelled at using personal relationships to achieve national goals. His legacy became one of redemption for some historians and one of convenient moral evolution for others.
As the Constitutional Convention convened in Philadelphia in 1787, the tensions among the founders reached new heights. Delegates arrived with competing visions shaped by regional economies, personal investments, and philosophical beliefs. The issue of slavery dominated discussions, though it was often addressed indirectly through debates about representation and taxation. Southern delegates demanded that enslaved individuals be counted toward population totals to increase political power, while Northern delegates resisted granting representation to populations denied citizenship. The resulting 3/5 compromise counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person for representation purposes, a decision that exposed the founders' willingness to mathematically quantify human lives for political advantage. The compromise preserved unity, but entrenched slavery's influence in federal governance, ensuring the issue would haunt the nation for generations. James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, played a crucial role in crafting the document's structure. Madison believed in balancing competing interests through a complex system of checks and balances. Yet Madison himself owned enslaved people and struggled privately with the moral contradiction between his advocacy for liberty and his participation in slavery. Madison rarely spoke publicly about abolition during his most influential years, fearing it would destabilize the fragile alliance between Northern and Southern states. His silence illustrates a broader pattern among the founders, many of whom recognized slavery's injustice but prioritized national unity and personal economic security over immediate reform. The ratification debates that followed the convention exposed deep distrust among Americans. Anti-Federalists feared the Constitution granted excessive power to centralized government, while Federalists argued strong authority was necessary to prevent chaos. The Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay, attempted to persuade the public through eloquent arguments about governance and stability. Yet these essays also served as political propaganda, carefully framing the Constitution's strengths while minimizing concerns about potential abuses of power. The founders, often portrayed as unified visionaries, engaged in intense political maneuvering that resembled modern campaign strategies more than noble philosophical debate. Washington's presidency, widely regarded as a period of steady leadership, was far from tranquil behind closed doors. Washington struggled to maintain neutrality amid fierce partisan conflicts between Hamilton and Jefferson. Their disagreements extended beyond policy into personal hostility, with each man believing the other threatened the republic's future. Washington's cabinet meetings often resembled battlegrounds of ideology and ego. Though Washington publicly projected calm authority, his private correspondence reveals frustration and exhaustion. He feared political parties would divide the nation irreparably, yet his administration inadvertently accelerated their formation. The Whiskey Rebellion of 1794 tested Washington's commitment to federal authority. Western farmers protested a federal tax on whiskey, viewing it as unfair economic oppression. Washington responded by leading a massive militia force to suppress the rebellion, demonstrating the federal government's willingness to use military power against its own citizens. To supporters, Washington preserved order and law. To critics, he betrayed the revolutionary spirit of resisting unjust taxation. The event highlighted how quickly revolutionary leaders could adopt the authoritative tactics they once condemned when they believed national stability was at risk. Jefferson's presidency, beginning in 1801, promised a return to Republican simplicity, yet his administration revealed further contradictions.
Jefferson publicly championed limited government, but authorized the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, doubling the nation's size, through an executive action that stretched constitutional interpretation. Jefferson justified the purchase as a necessary opportunity, but privately acknowledged doubts about its legality. The acquisition opened vast territories for expansion, accelerating displacement of Native American tribes and expansion of slavery into new lands. Jefferson's vision of an empire of liberty depended on territorial growth that carried devastating consequences for indigenous populations and enslaved individuals. Jefferson also authorized secret military actions against the Barbary states to combat piracy and protect American trade routes. While he avoided formally declaring war, these campaigns marked early examples of executive military authority exercised without explicit congressional approval. The precedent raised questions about executive power that would echo through American history. As the founding generation aged, personal rivalries hardened into lasting feuds. The bitter conflict between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson symbolized the ideological divide shaping the young republic. Once allies during the Revolution, they became political enemies, exchanging public criticisms and private insults through supporters in newspapers and pamphlets. Their rivalry influenced policy decisions and deepened partisan divisions among Americans. Ironically, in their final years, Adams and Jefferson reconciled through heartfelt letters reflecting on their shared revolutionary past. Their deaths on July 4, 1826, the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, seemed almost mythic, reinforcing their legendary status while leaving unresolved the contradictions of their lives. Alexander Hamilton's story ended violently in 1804 during a duel with Aaron Burr, the sitting Vice President of the United States. The duel, rooted in years of political and personal hostility, revealed how fragile honor and reputation remained among the nation's elite. Hamilton's death shocked the country and underscored the persistence of aristocratic codes of conduct within a republic supposedly founded on rational law and civic virtue. Burr's career collapsed afterward, illustrating how personal conflict among the founders could reshape national politics. The generation that created the United States left behind a legacy filled with brilliance and contradiction. Their achievements in establishing constitutional governance, democratic principles, and national independence were undeniable. Yet their private lives and political decisions exposed moral compromises shaped by economic interests, cultural norms, and personal ambition. The founders built a framework of liberty while tolerating systems of inequality that contradicted their stated ideals.
As the early 19th century unfolded, the shadows cast by these contradictions grew longer. The expansion of slavery into Western territories intensified sectional conflict. Native American displacement accelerated through treaties, often negotiated under coercion or broken entirely. The political structures designed by the founders allowed the nation to grow, but also preserved the unresolved tensions they had postponed. The founders had created a republic built on aspirational ideals, but they had also embedded within it the seeds of conflict that would eventually erupt into civil war. Yet the enduring fascination with the Founding Fathers lies precisely in their complexity. They were not mythic figures carved from pure virtue, nor were they simple villains driven solely by selfishness. They were products of their time, navigating unprecedented political challenges while wrestling with personal desires and societal pressures. Their secrets, controversies, and moral failures reveal a more honest portrait of the nation's birth, a story not of flawless heroes, but of ambitious individuals attempting to construct a new political world while carrying the burdens of the old one.
And as America continued to grow, the myths surrounding these men grew alongside it, carefully polished through monuments, textbooks, and patriotic celebration, often leaving their darker truths buried beneath layers of national pride. But the shadows never truly disappeared. They lingered in political debates, in the struggle over civil rights, and in the enduring question of whether the United States could fully realize the promises written in 1776 by men who themselves struggled to live by those very words. The passing of the founding generation did not end their influence. Instead, it transformed them into symbols whose reputations would be shaped, reshaped, and sometimes sanitized by the generations that followed. As the United States moved into the early decades of the 19th century, the young nation struggled to reconcile the ideals of liberty with the realities embedded within its founding documents and traditions. The shadows left behind by the Founding Fathers quietly shaped political decisions, social movements, and territorial ambitions in ways that many Americans did not fully recognize at the time. After Jefferson and Adams died in 1826, Americans began to memorialize the founders as near-mythic heroes. Their personal contradictions faded from public memory, replaced by simplified narratives of courage and wisdom. School books, political speeches, and public celebrations elevated them into moral examples meant to unify the nation. Yet beneath this growing reverence, policies inspired or justified by the founders' earlier compromises continued to reshape American society, often at devastating cost to marginalized communities. James Monroe, the fifth president and the last to belong to the founding generation, inherited a nation that appeared stable on the surface but simmered with unresolved conflict. His presidency, often remembered as the era of good feelings, masked deep sectional tensions over slavery and economic power. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, negotiated during Monroe's administration, exposed how fragile national unity truly was. Missouri sought admission to the Union as a slave state, threatening to upset the balance between free and slave states in Congress. The agreement allowed Missouri to enter as a slave state while admitting Maine as a free state and drawing a geographic line limiting slavery's expansion in certain territories. The agreement temporarily preserved peace but reinforced the founders' earlier decision to delay confronting slavery directly. By treating slavery as a political balancing act rather than a moral crisis, American leaders extended the institution's life and intensified its eventual reckoning. The agreement echoed earlier constitutional decisions that placed national unity above immediate justice, demonstrating how the founders' willingness to postpone difficult questions continued shaping policy decades after their deaths. Meanwhile, American expansion accelerated across the continent, driven by economic ambition and a growing belief that the United States had a destiny to control North America. The concept, later called manifest destiny, drew inspiration from Jefferson's vision of territorial growth, though Jefferson himself had imagined expansion as a pathway to widespread agricultural independence. In practice, expansion meant increasing pressure on Native American nations whose lands stood in the path of American settlement. Andrew Jackson, who rose to prominence as a military hero and later became president in 1829, embodied the aggressive expansionist spirit that had roots in the founders' land ambitions. Jackson admired the revolutionary generation, but interpreted their legacy through a lens of populist nationalism and frontier survival. His presidency marked a turning point in federal Indian policy, culminating in the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This law authorized the forced relocation of Native American tribes from their ancestral homelands in the southeastern United States to territories west of the Mississippi River. Jackson framed removal as a humanitarian effort designed to prevent violent conflict between settlers and native communities. However, the reality proved catastrophic. Thousands of Cherokee, Creek, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole peoples were displaced through coerced treaties and military enforcement. The forced migrations, particularly the Cherokee Trail of Tears, resulted in immense suffering and death. The policies reflected expansionist attitudes that had existed among many founders who viewed westward growth as essential to the nation's prosperity, even when it required dispossessing indigenous populations. At the same time, slavery expanded deeper into new territories opened by westward migration. The invention of the cotton gin in the late 1700s had transformed cotton into a profitable export crop, strengthening the economic importance of slavery in the southern states. Plantation agriculture spread across Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas, increasing demand for enslaved labor. The domestic slave trade intensified as enslaved individuals were forcibly relocated from older eastern plantations to newly opened lands in the Deep South.
The moral contradiction between American liberty and slavery became increasingly visible to both domestic reformers and international observers. Abolitionist movements gained strength in northern states, fueled by religious revivalism and humanitarian activism. Figures such as Frederick Douglass and William Lloyd Garrison publicly condemned slavery as a national sin, frequently referencing the Declaration of Independence's promise of equality. Their arguments highlighted the founders' contradictions, using the founders' own words to challenge the nation's failure to live up to its ideals. Public memory of the Founding Fathers, however, remained carefully curated. Political leaders and educators often emphasized the founders' achievements while minimizing their moral compromises. Washington was portrayed as the flawless father of the nation, Jefferson as the philosopher of liberty, and Franklin as the wise elder statesman. These heroic narratives served an important cultural purpose, offering Americans shared symbols during a period of rapid territorial and social change. Yet this myth-making also discouraged honest examination of how the founders' personal decisions had shaped the structural inequalities embedded within American society. During the 1840s and 1850s, sectional conflict intensified as new territories sought statehood. Each admission threatened to disrupt the balance between free and slave states, repeating the same crisis that had surfaced during the Missouri Compromise. The Compromise of 1850 attempted to maintain peace by admitting California as a free state while strengthening the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens and law enforcement in free states to assist in capturing escaped enslaved individuals. The law outraged abolitionists and exposed the federal government's willingness to enforce slavery across state lines. Debates over slavery increasingly invoked the founders' legacy. Pro-slavery advocates argued that the founders had accepted slavery as part of the nation's framework, citing constitutional compromises as evidence. Abolitionists countered that the founders had viewed slavery as a temporary evil that future generations were expected to eliminate. The founders' ambiguous positions allowed both sides to claim historical legitimacy, demonstrating how their unresolved contradictions fueled political division. The election of Abraham Lincoln in 1960 marked a turning point in this long struggle. Lincoln admired the Founding Fathers and frequently referenced their writings in his speeches. He viewed the Declaration of Independence as a moral blueprint that placed the nation on a path toward eventual equality. Lincoln argued that while the founders had tolerated slavery for pragmatic reasons, they had intentionally left open the possibility of its eventual abolition.
His interpretation framed the Civil War as a continuation of the founders' unfinished work, rather than a rejection of their legacy. The Civil War exposed the full consequences of the founders' compromises. The conflict, which lasted from 1861 to 1865, claimed hundreds of thousands of lives and devastated large portions of the country. The abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment represented a monumental step toward fulfilling the ideals articulated in 1776. Yet the war also demonstrated the enormous cost of delaying moral reckoning. The founders' decision to prioritize unity over confronting slavery had preserved the young republic, but ultimately led to a far bloodier resolution decades later. Following the Civil War, the United States entered the Reconstruction era, during which the federal government attempted to rebuild the South and secure civil rights for newly freed African Americans. The 14th and 15th Amendments granted citizenship and voting rights regardless of race, reflecting a dramatic expansion of democratic principles. However, Reconstruction faced fierce resistance, and by the late 19th century, many of its reforms had been undermined by segregation laws and discriminatory practices. The persistence of racial inequality illustrated how deeply slavery's legacy, rooted in the Founders' era, had shaped American institutions. As the nation entered the 20th century, historical scholarship began reevaluating the founders with greater scrutiny. Historians uncovered personal letters, financial records, and eyewitness accounts that revealed more complex portraits of these influential figures. Jefferson's relationship with Sally Hemings gained increased scholarly attention. Washington's management of enslaved labor at Mount Vernon became more widely documented. Hamilton's political maneuvering and personal scandals were re-examined through newly discovered evidence. These studies challenged earlier heroic narratives and encouraged Americans to confront a more nuanced understanding of their national origins. Public debate over the founders' legacy intensified during the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. Activists such as Martin Luther King Jr. invoked the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution to argue that African Americans were demanding rights already promised by the nation's founding principles. King famously described these documents as a promissory note that America had yet to fully honor. His speeches highlighted the dual nature of the founders' legacy, documents that inspired liberation movements while originating from a society that tolerated profound inequality.
The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw further reassessment of the founders' reputations. Museums, educational institutions, and public monuments increasingly acknowledged the complexities of these historical figures. Discussions about memorials and statues sparked national debates about how to remember leaders who contributed to both democratic progress and systemic injustice. Some Americans viewed critical examination of the founders as necessary historical honesty, while others feared it undermined national identity. These debates reflected the continuing power of the founders' mythic status and the difficulty of reconciling pride with historical accountability. Today, the story of the Founding Fathers remains deeply intertwined with American cultural identity. Their achievements in establishing democratic governance continue to influence political systems worldwide. At the same time, their personal flaws and controversial decisions offer important lessons about the dangers of elevating leaders beyond scrutiny. The founders operated within a world shaped by 18th-century social norms, economic pressures, and political uncertainty. Yet their choices created institutions that continue to affect millions of lives centuries later. The enduring fascination with their hidden histories lies not in diminishing their accomplishments, but in understanding the complexity of human leadership. The founders were revolutionaries who challenged monarchy and established a republic, but they were also individuals shaped by ambition, fear, and cultural limitations. Their secrets reveal the tension between aspiration and reality that defines much of American history. The nation they created has continually wrestled with fulfilling ideals written by men who themselves struggled to embody them fully. And as Americans continued debating equality, liberty, and national identity, the shadows of the Founding Fathers remain present, not as distant relics, but as living influences woven into the country's laws, traditions, and moral conversations. If this journey through history sparked your curiosity, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Tell us which explorer or historical figure you want to uncover next, because the past is packed with bold risks, untold stories, and forgotten paths that quietly reshaped the world we live in today.